I'm Scott Ritter. Let me walk you through what's really going on with this war, the peace plan, the neocons, the EU, and why gold and capital are fleeing toward the United States all in one continuous flow, no commercials, no website pitches. I was asked back behind closed doors because the White House once called in a man to help design a peace plan for the Ukraine, Russia, NATO mess. That man is Martin Armstrong, the cycle guy, the one whose computer models have been frighteningly accurate about war, markets, and political breakdowns for decades. His peace plan, believe it or not, made it all the way to Moscow. According to him, it reached Putin's desk. A few days later, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov publicly stated that Russia was willing to guarantee it had no intention of invading NATO. That wasn't random. That statement, Martin believes, was directly inspired by the report he sent. The core of his argument is simple. The real enemy for Europe is not Russia, it's the European Union itself. Russia has no rational interest in invading NATO. There's no upside. Europe has to buy energy from Russia. If Putin marched into Paris, the big French ask would be, "You're paying our pensions now." That's not a serious strategic prize. Wars of conquest are almost always economically driven. Japan went into Manchuria because there were resources to grab. The only time ideology truly drove near war was with Khrushchev, "We will bury you," genuine Marxist zeal against capitalism. Even then, the underlying reality was still the business cycle. Martin comes from cycles. He studied Kondratiev, the long wave guy who was executed under Stalin for saying the business cycle would outlast communism. He's had Fed chairmen quietly acknowledge the same thing. Arthur Burns said the business cycle always wins. Paul Volcker wrote about rediscovering it. And in private, Volcker told Martin the model was right, that there is an 8-year rhythm, a kind of economic heartbeat that keeps thumping no matter what ideology is in fashion. It's this same framework that Martin uses to talk about war on Ukraine in the peace plan. Here's the picture. Martin laid out to people in Washington that Russia is not trying to swallow Europe. The real danger comes from a European political and economic establishment that is delusional enough to think it can defeat Russia, seize its natural resources, and rebuild some fantasy empire, whether British, European, or Neo-Roman. These are the same minds that tell themselves NATO has 3.4 million troops, Russia has 1.5 million, so they can just walk into Russia, take everything, and Putin will beg for his life. That's the mentality. That's the madness. When Trump made a sarcastic crack that Russia was a paper tiger and Ukraine could take back all its land and more, he wasn't being serious. He was mocking the fairy tale NATO strategists whisper to themselves. Meanwhile, Armstrong's peace plan circulates. It's seen by the Russians. It's passed around political circles in the US. And quietly, he gets invited again, political cocktail parties, closed-door conversations with people who aren't just some random donors. These are people who know Trump, who move in the same orbit. They're not calling him to tell him he's an idiot. They're calling because they know exactly who the neocons are, and they know Martin understands both the history and the cast of characters better than most. One of those characters is Scott Bessent. Most people only know Bessent as the guy who worked for Soros. What they don't know is that he was the real brains behind some of Soros's biggest trades. Soros himself, in pure trading terms, was mediocre. Martin says he traded against him many times. The real engine, especially behind the famous British pound trade, was people like Bessent. Later, Bessent jumped onto the crush Russia trade in the 1,990 seconds. The idea was simple and brutal. Use Wall Street banks, hedge funds, and captured international institutions. Force Russia into a trap. Carve up its assets, oil, gas, gold, diamonds, lumber, and run them all through New York. Dealing desks. Martin was there when they pitched this. They told him, "Put in $10 billion and we'll give you $100 billion back." He said, "My computer says Russia is going to collapse." They said, "Don't worry. We're replacing Yeltsin with Berezovsky. We'll control the presidency and the assets." He refused. They then proceeded with a regime change operation complete with a staged $7 billion wire of IMF money routed through a shady Geneva entity, then discovered as money laundering at a New York bank. Martin warned them That money was going straight to Yeltsin. Russia's own FBI equivalent had come to New York to investigate. This was a coup attempt, not some normal transaction. Yeltsin eventually realized he was being set up both by Western financial operators and by Russian hardliners who then moved to impeach him. Squeezed from both sides, he turned to Putin. Putin was neither a communist nor a captured oligarch. That's why they hate him so much. That's why Yeltsin's last words were reportedly, "Protect Russia." Armstrong was in the middle of all this. That's why he says what he says with so much certainty. Now, fast forward. The same mentality that wanted to break up Russia in the 90 seconds still wants a broken, dismembered Russia today for the same reason: assets. Russia has an estimated $75 trillion in natural resources. That's about twice the U.S. national debt. To get there, they need a compliant government in Moscow or a shattered Russian state that can't defend itself. They didn't get that in the 1,990 seconds. Putin slammed that door shut, so now the play shifts. NATO expansion, Ukraine as a proxy battlefield, economic warfare, sanctions, asset seizures, information operations, and constant pressure to push Russia into either collapse or overreach. Armstrong's computer, however, sees something else. It forecasts a world war starting from the Ukraine-Russia front, but spreading globally. It sees not just one conflict, but multiple flashpoints: Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, the Balkans. It shows the European Union losing and, in his view, not lasting much beyond 2030. Wars, he reminds us, typically last about 3 years. The pressure to kick off something bigger in Europe, he says, is intense as soon as next year. And for Europe, the outcome is catastrophic. Inside the EU, the economics are already broken. When Martin was called in to help design the euro, he told them plainly, if you don't consolidate the debts of member states into a single federal debt, this will blow up. They refused. Germany's Kohl explicitly blocked it. He later admitted that if Germans had been allowed to vote on joining the euro, he would have lost by a wide margin. So they dragged Germany into a currency union built on rotten architecture. No unified sovereign debt. Individual countries issuing their own bonds. Banks stuffed with a cornucopia of different national debts, and pension funds legally forced to hold government paper that may never be paid back. Now, as yields rise and economies stagnate, the whole thing is hanging by a thread. In this environment, European leaders have two choices: default and face their own citizens in the streets, or try to use war as a cover for otherwise unpayable losses and political collapse. That's why Martin says they need war. If the defaults start in France, for example, the second largest economy in the EU, everybody will look at which banks hold the most French debt, which pension funds are most exposed. Traders will short those institutions. Panic spreads, confidence collapses, capital flees. This is why he keeps saying Europe is in desperate shape. From the U.S. vantage point, the story is different, but not exactly happy. Martin's computer shows Europe heading into depression, the United States heading into stagflation and recession, but not depression. Capital flowing from Europe and other unstable centers into the U.S., into equities and hard assets like gold. He notes that some major European clients have already moved their gold from London and Zurich to the United States. They see what's coming: capital controls, limits on gold buying, possible bans on Bitcoin, currency cancellations designed to flush out unreported cash. Europe is already forcing people crossing borders to declare all their accounts, including crypto. Cash transactions are tightly capped. They want everything on the grid, everything trackable, everything taxable or seizable. That's why, in his view, gold is rising, because trust in governments and their bonds is collapsing. He believes by 2032, the Dow could be at 60,000 inches nominal terms, not because of real prosperity, but because of inflation, debasement, and global capital fleeing into the only major market still standing. Gold and silver in that framework are not investments so much as survival assets in a sovereign debt crisis. AI fits into this picture too, but not the way the hype machine pretends. Armstrong wrote about known versus unknown. AI is incredibly powerful for organizing and reasoning over what's already known. It is not capable of discovering truly new principles or making human gut level leaps. IBM's Watson was supposed to cure cancer. They fed it mountains of medical data. It failed. The models couldn't discover. They could only recombine what they'd been given in trading, for example. A good human will sometimes act on a gut feeling that comes from experience, pattern recognition, and risk sense. AI doesn't have that internal compass, at least not in the way a trader on a desk does. But it will transform the economy, much like the internet did. Um, Massive hype, bubbles, and frauds. Real underlying technology that reshapes entire sectors. A crash that clears the speculation. Survivor companies that become the new backbone of the system. So, yes, there will be layoffs. Some jobs will be automated out, others will be created. But AI isn't going to replace everything or magically solve structural problems like war, corruption, and debt. Inside America's own political system, the picture isn't pretty either. Martin's models show the Democratic Party fragmenting and eventually blowing itself up, major blue states like New York and California tipping into an uncompetitive spiral, capital and people fleeing to Florida, Texas, and other states that still somewhat respect economic reality. Instead of asking, why are people leaving? These states double down on punitive policies like exit taxes and expanded benefits for non citizens, while their own infrastructure and citizens deteriorate. This is what late stage political systems do. They become more ideological, less responsive to reality, increasingly tyrannical and punitive. On top of this, you see lawfare, opposition leaders jailed in Pakistan, Brazil, Romania, Macron trying to cripple Le Pen, Trump dragged through endless legal battles, free speech targeted across Europe. Once the rule of law breaks down and the legal system becomes just another political weapon, it's no longer safe for global capital. The first question any serious investor asks is country risk. Will this country obey its own laws? If the answer is no, not if politics intervenes, capital eventually leaves. That's where civil war risk comes in. Armstrong's computer runs two distinct models, one for international wars, one for civil wars. The bad news is they both peak in the same general window. He sees the United States so polarized that eventual breakup is on the table. Europe similarly fractured, countries everywhere sliding into internal conflict as elites cling to power and weaponize institutions against their own citizens. In this environment, if you are sitting in Washington, the last thing you should want is a full-scale war with Russia in Europe. You will already have internal unrest, economic slowdown, political fragmentation, and yet the neocons in Brussels, London, Washington keep pushing. So what's the core of Armstrong's message to those who still listen? It boils down to this: Russia is not your real enemy. The EU's own design flaws and the neocon war machine are a much bigger long-term threat to Western stability than Moscow is. NATO has become a neocon retirement home. Its purpose now is to justify budgets and power, not to ensure genuine security. As long as Putin is coming, remains the slogan, they can demand 5% of GDP and funnel billions into black holes of corruption like Ukraine. If the US steps back, the war shrinks. If America signals that it will not back infinite escalation, Russia has no rational reason to throw hypersonic missiles at New York or Washington. The real costs fall on Europe. If the US stays all in, it risks being dragged into a three-front disaster: global war, domestic civil conflict, structural economic crisis. In all of this, Armstrong is not claiming he can overturn the big cycles. He says he can't beat his own computer. Every time he's tried, he's lost. But what he does believe is that while you can't change the underlying direction of the cycle, you can sometimes change the amplitude, how violent it becomes. That's what his peace plan, his back channel messages, and his warnings are aimed at. Reducing the level of chaos, lowering the odds of outright catastrophe, giving the US a path to step back from Europe's suicidal fantasies. So, where does that leave ordinary people? From this framework, several conclusions follow. Physical gold and silver are worth holding, not because they're magical, but because trust in governments and paper assets is being systematically destroyed. The US will likely remain the least bad major destination for capital, but that doesn't mean it's stable or healthy, just less broken than Europe or certain other regions. AI will reshape the economy, but it won't save us from political stupidity, war fever, or debt. The real driver of events is the business cycle and the political cycle, not slogans about democracy, freedom, or rules based orders. And above all, wars are not created by the average Russian, American, German, or Chinese citizen. They are created by elites. Most people in Moscow, Berlin, Paris, Beijing, or Des Moines just want to live their lives, raise their kids, and not be dragged into someone else's deranged empire building project. But the system we're living in now, especially in Europe and increasingly in North America, is run by people who think they can defy cycles, dodge accountability, nationalize risk, privatize gains, and then use war, censorship, and financial control to glue it all together. That's why the cycles are turning. That's why gold is rising. That's why capital is moving. And that's why, whether anyone in power wants to hear it or not, voices like Armstrong's keep getting called back into the room. And why I, Scott Ritter, am sitting here laying this all out in one piece so you can hear it without the noise, without the ads, and decide for yourself what kind of world we're actually heading into.